They called him the kitchen boy, just 16 years old. Too young to shave, too small to carry a rifle, but somehow, he had lied his way into the U.S. Army in 1944. His name was William Parker, but everyone called him Will. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't trained to kill. He was there to cook to feed the real men who fought the war. The first day he arrived at the base in Normandy, the veterans laughed. "Hey, kid, you gonna feed the Germans to death?" Another shouted, "Don't drop the soup like you dropped your courage." Will smiled shyly and said nothing. He was used to being underestimated. Every morning before sunrise, he'd light the stoves, boiling water in dented pots, stirring soup with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the chill of the dawn. He could hear artillery rumbling in the distance, like a giant growling beyond the horizon. He'd watch the soldiers clean their rifles, check their grenades, and march toward the front lines. And he'd stay behind serving food, washing dishes, waiting for them to return. Sometimes, they didn't. Each empty seat at the mess tent felt like a wound he couldn't see. Every time he served a meal, he thought, that could have been me. He wanted to fight, to prove that he wasn't just a boy who stirred soup. But his sergeant had made it clear, you're here to feed, not to fight. Then came that morning, cold, foggy, and quiet. Too quiet. Will was carrying coffee pots when the first shots rang out. A burst of German MG-42 fire shredded the stillness. Bullets ripped through canvas tents, splintering wooden tables. Men screamed. The commander was hit before he could even reach his rifle. The unit was pinned down, no one could move. The machine gun nest hidden in the tree line was cutting them apart. Will dropped the coffee pot, hot liquid splashing across his boots. His hands shook, not from fear, but from something else. Rage. He could see his brother's soldiers who had teased him, protected him, shared their last cigarettes with him, bleeding out in the mud. He grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a fallen soldier's M1 Garand, and crawled toward the edge of the camp. Bullets cracked above him, but he didn't stop. Every step forward felt like a lifetime. The boy who had once been laughed at was gone. Something inside him had changed. Something fierce and unstoppable. He wasn't the kitchen boy anymore. He was a soldier, and he was going to end that machine gun nest or die trying. That was the moment. History began to remember his name. The smoke burned his lungs. The crack of bullets cut through the air like angry thunder. Will pressed himself flat against the cold earth, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear anything else. He wasn't supposed to be there, he wasn't supposed to fight. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Ahead of him, hidden behind a wall of jagged rocks and barbed wire, was the German machine gun nest. The MG-42, the buzz saw. They called it, was spitting death at nearly 1,200 rounds a minute. Every burst tore another piece of the world apart. And somewhere behind Will, his brothers were dying. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, just get close. Just close enough. He crawled forward, inch by inch. Mud clung to his uniform, and the smell of gunpowder filled his nose. The ground shook as shells exploded nearby. He could hear German voices shouting, laughing, confident, certain that no one could reach them. Will's fingers brushed against something in the mud, a grenade. The pin was still intact. He looked at it, then at the nest ahead. He could feel the pulse in his wrist beating faster. He checked his distance. Too far. He'd have to get closer. Behind him, a wounded sergeant shouted, "Kid, get back. That's an order." But Will didn't stop. He couldn't. Every step closer, he thought of the men who had mocked him in the kitchen. The ones who had said he wasn't a real soldier. The ones who now lay bleeding in the dirt. He owed them this. The MG-42 opened fire again, cutting down a medic who had tried to move. That was it. Something inside Will snapped. He ran, not crawling, not ducking. He sprinted across open ground, the machine gun roaring, bullets slicing past his shoulders. He dove behind a broken jeep, panting hard, gripping the grenade. His hands were trembling, but his eyes were calm. He could see the nest now, sandbags, steel barrels, 2 Germans reloading. He counted, 3, 2, 1. He yanked the pin and threw. For a split second, everything slowed. The grenade arced through the air, spinning toward the nest. The Germans shouted, scrambled too late. The explosion was deafening. Smoke and dust burst upward, echoing across the field. The MG-42 went silent. Will stayed low, coughing, ears ringing. He didn't know if it was over not yet. He grabbed his rifle, moved forward, and saw one of the gunners crawling, trying to reach for his pistol. Will raised the M1, finger steady, and pulled the trigger. One shot, then silence. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the destroyed machine gun nest. He couldn't believe what he had done. The kitchen boy, the one they laughed at, had just taken out a German MG-42 position alone. Behind him, his fellow soldiers began to rise. Someone shouted, "Holy hell, that kid did it." Another voice echoed, "That's no cook. That's a hero." But Will didn't smile. He just looked at the smoke, then down at his hands. The battle was over. Smoke drifted across the field, carrying the bitter scent of burnt metal and blood. Will stood silently, his uniform soaked in mud and sweat. His hands still trembled, but not from fear, from what he had just done. A few soldiers approached him, limping, covered in bandages. "Kid," one said, voice cracking, "you just saved our damn lives." Another slapped him on the back. "That was insane. You're one of us now, Will." Laughter mixed with pain filled the air. For the first time, no one called him Kitchen Boy. Now, they called him the hero. But Will didn't feel like one. He couldn't forget the image of the German gunner reaching for his pistol, his face pale with fear. And then the silence after Will pulled the trigger. That silence haunted him more than the sound of the gunfire. Later that night, the campfire burned low. Men passed around a bottle of whiskey, singing off-key songs to drown out the memories. Will sat alone, staring into the flames. Every crackle reminded him of the explosion he caused that morning. He tried to tell himself it was necessary, that he had done what he had to do, but his heart whispered something else. He was a cook, not a killer, and yet, he had killed. The sergeant, arm in a sling, walked over and sat beside him. "You did good today, Parker," he said softly. "You saved this unit." Will didn't look up. "Sir, I didn't even think. I just..." "That's what soldiers do," the sergeant interrupted. "We don't think, we act. You've got more guts than half the men out here." The words should have felt like praise. Instead, they felt heavy. Will finally nodded, but his eyes stayed on the fire. That night, he dreamed of the gun nest again, only this time, he was on the other side. He woke up drenched in sweat. Days passed. Everywhere he went, men saluted him, clapped his shoulder, called him the kid who took down the MG. They told the story to every new recruit. They exaggerated it, said he charged through fire, said he threw 2 grenades, said he shouted, "For America." Before the explosion, Will never corrected them. He just smiled quietly. Inside, though, he wondered if the war had stolen something from him that he'd never get back. One evening, he was back at his stove again, stirring a pot. The familiar rhythm, almost comforting. A new soldier came up and said, "You're Parker, right? The hero cook?" Will didn't answer right away. He just handed the soldier a bowl of stew and said, "I'm just the guy who feeds the real heroes." But as he watched the steam rise from the pot, he realized something important. The same hands that could destroy, could also create. The same heart that fought, could still care. And maybe that was what real courage meant. Because heroes weren't born from glory, they were born from pain and the will to keep going. It had been 2 weeks since the machine gun nest. The camp was quieter now, at least on the surface. But under that calm, the war still rumbled like a storm waiting to break. Will had gone back to his kitchen duties. Every morning, he boiled water, chopped potatoes, and pretended the world wasn't on fire. The other soldiers treated him differently. Now, they didn't joke about him anymore. They'd pat his shoulder, ask how he was doing, call him "sir," half seriously. He didn't like it. He wanted to be invisible again. But war has a cruel way of finding those who try to hide from it. One afternoon, as Will stirred a pot of stew, the sergeant walked in, his face tight with urgency. "Parker," he said, "pack up. You're coming with us." Will looked up, confused. "Sir, I'm on kitchen duty." "Not anymore. Battalion's short on men. We're moving east at dawn. You're part of the detail." The words hit like a bullet. He wasn't ready. He'd thought that moment by the MG-42 was a one-time thing, a burst of courage that fate had demanded. But now, fate was calling again. That night, Will sat alone outside the tent, staring at his rifle. The moonlight glinted off the barrel, cold and silent. He whispered to himself, "I'm a cook, not a killer." But deep down, he knew. War didn't care what you were. Once it chose you, you didn't get to choose back. At dawn, they moved out, 6 men in a jeep, heading toward a ruined French village that the Germans still controlled. The air smelled of smoke and death. The village had been beautiful once. Cobblestone streets, flower boxes under windows, children's toys lying forgotten in the dust. Now, it was rubble. As they approached the outskirts, gunfire erupted from the bell tower. The convoy stopped instantly. Bullets shattered windshields. One soldier fell before he could even aim. Will ducked behind the jeep, heart pounding, flashbacks flooding his mind. The sound of the MG-42, the explosion, the screams all came rushing back. He could feel his hands shaking again. The sergeant shouted, "We need a flank. Parker, Miller, take the right alley." Will hesitated. "Sir, I'm..." "Now, Parker, no time to think, no time to breathe, just move." He followed Miller down the narrow alleyway. The walls were scarred with bullet holes. Every step crunched broken glass. They could see the bell tower ahead, and the muzzle flash from the machine gun inside. Will felt the old fire rising again, the same force that had driven him through the bullets last time. But there was something different now. He wasn't driven by rage anymore. He was driven by duty, the kind that comes when you stop thinking about survival and start thinking about others. He turned to Miller and said quietly, "Cover me." Miller's eyes widened. "Kid, you can't." But Will was already moving. He pressed forward, every heartbeat louder than the gunfire. Another mission had begun, and once again, the kitchen boy was walking straight into the fire. The narrow alley smelled of gunpowder and dust. Will's boots slipped on broken glass as he crept forward, rifle tight against his chest. Behind him, Miller followed, older, experienced, but breathing hard from fear. Above them, the German machine gun barked from the bell tower, short bursts, precise, merciless. Every echo bounced off the stone walls, making it impossible to tell exactly where the shots came from. "Stay low," Miller whispered. Will nodded. They slid behind a collapsed wall, scanning the church ahead. The tall stone tower loomed over the ruins like a ghost from another time. A perfect sniper's nest. Through the smoke, Will spotted movement. A muzzle flash high in the tower window. "Two up there," he whispered. "A gunner and a spotter." Miller frowned. "We'll never get close from the street. We need another way." Will looked around. Rubble everywhere. A side door half buried under debris. "That's our way," he said. They crawled, inch by inch, toward the church's side entrance. Each heartbeat felt like thunder in Will's ears. He could hear the rattle of the MG-42 above them, cutting through the air. The Germans didn't know they were there, not yet. Inside the church, it was dark and cold. Broken pews lay scattered, sunlight cutting through holes in the roof like ghostly beams. A statue of Christ stood near the altar, its face cracked but serene, watching them silently. Will stared at it for a moment, then whispered, "Watch over us." And then, he began to climb. The spiral staircase to the tower was narrow, the steps slippery with dust. Every creak sounded like a gunshot. Miller followed close behind, his rifle ready. Halfway up, a German voice echoed from above, shouting orders. Unaware that death was climbing toward them, Will stopped. He could see light coming through the gap in the wooden floor above. He gestured to Miller, "Grenade." Miller nodded, pulled one from his belt, handed it to Will. The boy took a deep breath, pulled the pin, and rolled it through the hole. Boom! The explosion ripped through the air, shaking the tower. The bell above them groaned, swinging once, echoing like a ghostly scream. They stormed upward. Smoke filled the narrow space. Will burst through the hatch first, and there they were. 2 Germans, dazed but alive. One reached for the MG-42. Will fired first. The rifle kicked hard against his shoulder. One shot, then another. The gunner fell backward against the wall, blood painting the stone. The spotter screamed, trying to grab his pistol. Miller fired silence. For a long moment, The only sound was the bell swaying above them, its low hum vibrating through the floor. Will stepped to the shattered window, breathing hard. Below, his unit was advancing again, the street now clear. The machine gun nest was gone. Miller looked at him and said quietly, "You did it again, kid." Will shook his head. "No, we did it. The war didn't stop for anyone. It pressed on like an unrelenting tide, dragging every soldier forward." But for Will Parker, something had shifted. The village was quiet now. Smoke rose from shattered homes, but the Germans had retreated. His unit regrouped, counting their losses. The men who once mocked him as the kitchen boy now looked at him with awe, even reverence. A few days later, in a muddy field, surrounded by tents and the faint smell of gunpowder, Will stood at attention. His sergeant approached, silver star pinned to his chest. "You earned this, Parker," he said. The medal gleamed in the pale morning sun, a symbol of courage, of bravery beyond his years. Will's hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. He glanced at the other soldiers, smiling, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, but inside, the words felt hollow. He remembered the faces German soldiers, young men not much older than him, reaching for their weapons as the grenade fell. He remembered the scream of the bell tower, the smoke in his lungs, the blood on his hands. The hero title felt like a mask, hiding the truth he carried. That evening, he returned to the field kitchen. He stirred soup quietly, the only sound, the gentle clink of a spoon against the pot. A young recruit approached, looking up at him with wide eyes. "You're Will Parker, the hero of the MG-42 nest." Will smiled faintly, handing him a bowl. "I'm just the guy who feeds the heroes," he said. But as he watched the men eat, the faces of the soldiers, alive and whole, he felt something deeper. This was the real reward. Not the medal, not the applause, but the chance to save lives. One meal, one mission at a time. That night, under a sky full of stars, he sat alone. The war would continue. More battles, more fear, more loss. But for the first time, he understood courage in a way he never had in the kitchen. Courage wasn't the explosion of a grenade or the roar of a machine gun. It was staying alive long enough to care. It was holding on to humanity when the world tried to strip it away. It was the quiet acts that made the loudest difference. He thought about the men he saved, about the orders he had followed, and about the life he had almost lost. He realized that bravery was not about medals or recognition. It was about choices. To act, to protect, to endure. And in that moment, Will Parker, the boy they had laughed at, understood something the war couldn't teach in words. Being a hero wasn't about glory. It was about keeping others alive, even when it cost you pieces of yourself. The kitchen boy had fought. The soldier had survived. And the man, who now looked at the stars in silence, had learned the weight of both honor and humanity. Winter had come early that year. The wind in northern France bit like a knife, slicing through the thin canvas tents. Snow fell quietly over the ruins, covering the scars of battle, but not erasing them. Will Parker, once the kitchen boy, now wore a different look. His uniform was worn, his eyes sharper. The silver star hung tucked in his pocket, not for show, but as a reminder. The sergeant, his arms still stiff from wounds, called the men together. "Listen up. High command needs us to hold the ridge near Bastogne. Supplies are low, and command stretched thin. Parker, you're leading second squad." Will blinked. "Me, sir." The sergeant nodded. "You earned it, kid. Time to lead." Those words hit him harder than any explosion. Leadership. It wasn't just carrying a rifle now, it was carrying lives. That night, by the dim lantern light, Will studied the map. Snowflakes drifted onto the paper as he traced routes with his finger. He looked around the tent. The faces of men he had once served breakfast to. Now, they would follow his orders into battle. He whispered, almost to himself, "God, help me bring them back." At dawn, they marched through the snow, boots crunching in silence. The air was heavy with cold and fear. In the distance, artillery fire thudded like distant thunder. The ridge loomed ahead, a line of trees, smoke rising beyond. Halfway up, they took cover behind a frozen ditch. Will scanned through his binoculars. German forces had dug in deep machine guns, sandbags, mortars. Looks bad, said Corporal Reed beside him. Will nodded. We're not attacking head-on. We flanked them from the right, quietly. Every decision felt like a gamble, and every mistake would cost blood. They moved like shadows through the trees. Will led from the front, his rifle ready, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of every step, the weight of responsibility. Suddenly, a burst of fire cut through the quiet. One man went down. Medic! Will shouted, crawling toward him. Bullets hissed through the branches. He grabbed the wounded soldier by the collar, dragging him behind a tree. Stay with me, he yelled. The medic arrived, and Will turned to the others. Smoke grenades. Cover the right flank. Orders flew. The team moved like a single body, not perfect, but with purpose. Will wasn't fighting alone anymore. He was leading. The smoke gave them the break they needed. They stormed the enemy trench, shouting, firing, pushing forward through chaos. Will's world became a blur of snow, mud, and fire. When it was over, the ridge was theirs. As silence fell, the men looked at him differently, not as a boy, not even as a hero, but as a leader. Miller clapped him on the shoulder. Hell of a job, Lieutenant Cook. Will laughed, breathless. Don't call me that. But inside, he smiled. That night, as snow fell over the ridge, Will looked out across the battlefield. He had led men through fire and brought them back. For the first time, he felt peace, not from killing, but from protecting. December 1944. The snow never stopped falling. White flakes covered the helmets, the rifles, the frozen bodies. The men of the 101st were surrounded. No supplies, no airdrops, no reinforcements. Just the cold, the hunger, and the enemy. Will Parker sat by a half-buried foxhole, his hands trembling, not from fear but from frostbite. The firewood had run out days ago. He wrapped his scarf tighter and looked at the sky, gray, endless, and cruel. Lieutenant, we're out of rations, Corporal Reed said quietly. Will sighed, rubbing his face. How many days? 2, maybe 3 if we stretch the biscuits. Will nodded. Stretch them. Share with the wounded first. Around him, men huddled together like ghosts. No laughter now. No music from the radio. Just the distant rumble of German artillery. He looked at a photo in his pocket. His mother and little sister, smiling on their porch back in Kansas. He whispered, I'm coming home. I promise. But even he didn't know if that was true. By the second week, the snow had turned to ice. Frost covered the rifles. The medics had run out of morphine. Men screamed quietly in the night from their wounds. Still, no one surrendered. They were the 101st Airborne, the ones who never gave up. On Christmas Eve, a German messenger came with a white flag. He carried a letter demanding their surrender. Will stood beside the colonel as he read it. The colonel chuckled and said just one word, nuts. The messenger frowned, confused. What does this mean? Will smiled, replying, it means, go to hell. The soldiers burst into weak laughter, the first sound of life in weeks. That night, the men shared what little they had. Half a chocolate bar, a single can of beans, and a prayer. Will passed the food to a young soldier who had frostbite on his feet. Eat, kid, you'll need it more than me. The boy looked up, tears freezing on his cheeks. Why do you care so much, Lieutenant? Will smiled faintly. Because someone once cared for me. The snowstorm grew worse. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. But the enemy shells stopped. Silence spread across the white battlefield. Then, from the clouds, came a sound they hadn't heard in weeks. The roar of American planes. Supplies. Someone screamed. Parachutes drifted down like angels. Food. Ammo, blankets. Men cheered, cried, hugged each other. For the first time in a month, hope was real again. Will watch the parachutes fall, one hand clutching his chest. He whispered, we made it. We really made it. As the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, the siege of Bastogne began to lift. Will sat on the ridge, watching the white horizon. He had survived hunger, frost, and fear not through strength, but through faith. The kitchen boy had become a man forged in fire and ice. The train screeched to a stop. For the first time in years, Will Parker felt solid ground that wasn't shaking from artillery. He stepped out, the cold wind of Kansas brushing against his face. No gunfire, no shouting, just silence. Too much silence. The small town station hadn't changed. Same wooden benches, same ticking clock. But Will had changed more than he could explain. A few people recognized the uniform and clapped as he passed. Their smiles bright, their voices kind. "Welcome home, soldier." Will smiled faintly, but his eyes stayed distant. They couldn't see the ghosts marching behind him. At the end of the platform stood his mother, older now, but her eyes still full of love. She ran to him, arms trembling. "Will, my boy." He hugged her tightly, his breath catching. For a moment, the war melted away. That night, at home, the smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen. It reminded him of the army tent where he had cooked years ago, when he was just a boy with a pan and a dream. His mother placed a plate in front of him. "You used to love this." He looked down at the food, but didn't eat. His hands were shaking again. "Mom," he whispered, "do you ever smell gunpowder even when there's none?" She stopped. "Every soldier brings the war back home, Will. But you can put it down now." He wanted to believe her, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces, the ones who didn't come home. Weeks passed. The town moved on. The newspapers called them heroes. But Will didn't feel like one. One evening, he walked to the old church. It was quiet, lit only by candlelight. He knelt at the front pew and whispered, "Why me, God? Why did I survive?" From the shadows, the pastor spoke softly, "So you can feed others again, not with food, but with hope." The words struck deep. Will realized something: maybe his purpose wasn't over. He began helping other veterans, cooking for them, listening to their stories. He rebuilt the soup kitchen in town, and every night he served meals with the same gentle hands that once carried a rifle. People came not just for food, but for peace. And there, in that small kitchen, Will Parker found his own healing. Years later, children would point at him and ask, "Is that the man who fought in the war?" And their parents would smile and say, "No, that's the man who never stopped caring." The kitchen boy had finally come home, not to escape the war, but to end it within himself.